Autumn, 1856, Attakapas District, Louisiana. The cane is high enough to hiss when the wind lifts its blades. Bayous thread black through sugar country, sliding past raised houses and galleries where men drinking rye congratulate themselves for surviving another boil season. In the sacristy of St. Landry's, a priest fights a drawer that sticks the way drawers stick when they have learned to hold secrets. Inside, folded twice and pressed flat by a funeral register, is a page torn from a household daybook. The hand is a planter's, upright, confident, and the line he allowed himself to write is not the sort a man in his position writes unless he is tired and frightened. 3 houses fell after she stood in their door. The next page has been knifed out at the spine. The cut is neat. Practice shows. In a notary's packet, tied with twine and stained the color of chicory, an act of sale admits what polite archives often cannot. Justine, aged 17 and issue male, Basile, sold to Harlan Place to satisfy note due. In the margin, a clerk who could not otherwise afford a conscience has scribbled a word no paper requires: merciless. Lift a hearth brick at Belle Rave, a grand Creole house along Bayou Teche, its Greek dress now sagging, and you'll find a blue glass bottle, a fray of red thread still clinging to its neck, a curl of hair inside, and 9 bent nails the color of dried blood. A boy found it in 1903 and brought it to his grandmother, who took it out of his hand as if it might bite, and said flat, "Not for you." Her name in the ledgers that tried not to say it is Morel, called Mimi, nurse, sometimes Morel Baptiste. In mouths that remembered, it was Tante Mimi, Mère Noire, if you wanted to be respectful and scared at once. Enslaved, midwife, traiteuse, a healer whose prayers in French and Latin and older words with no church to hold them did what doctors with laudanum pretended to. Conjure woman, the Americans said when they needed a word big enough to cover their ignorance and their blame. Between September of 1856 and the following July, 3 households along the Teche and Vermilion collapsed like cane barns in a wrong wind. Bois du Chêne, the Deschamps, Côte Rouge, the Levines, and Harlan Place, the American, whose money had come downriver from Ohio and liked the sound of itself here. A sugar house boiler split at the seam. A cistern went bad and made throats taste like coins. An overseer's mouth sealed itself shut. A gallery cracked under men's feet, as if the house itself had decided to move on. The coroner called it misfortune. The doctor wrote the old Latin trismus for lockjaw, because Latin made guessing feel like science. The priest noted once, "A lady requests mirrors be turned to face the wall after sundown. Allow." And in the common talk under official ink, the line that survived as a whisper and then as a warning: "The masters were terrified of her." But who was she in the rooms before anyone needed a legend? What happened in the space between the sugar house and the sacristy? And why do so many pens go carefully blank the moment her name comes to a page? Before we continue, if this story grips you, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us what city or country you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. The Attakapas, 1850s, cane country. Between Opelousas and St. Martinville, the prairie gives way to a quilt of plantation names and waterways: the Teche, the Vermilion, stitched together by causeways that flood when they feel like it and levees that promise more than they can keep. The houses along the bayous wear their wealth out front. Galleries, shuttered windows, plaster painted the tender colors of fruit. Behind them, the engines that matter hum. Mills, rollers, boilers, the iron stomach of sugar that eats men's lives and spares nothing soft. Louisiana is not one thing. It is French and Spanish in the books, African and indigenous in the corners where books do not reach. The Code Noir formalized slavery into the language of Christian duty. The Civil Code makes the world into clauses. In sacristies and sitting rooms, men congratulate themselves for living according to rules. In quarters and kitchens, women keep the living alive according to knowledge that predates the parish. Traiteuses, folk healers, are part of this physics. A traiteuse speaks a prayer and lays hands and hot compresses and herbs without ever announcing which part did the work. She knows willow for fever, sassafras for swellings, rue and mint, and a dozen plants that go by two names depending on which mouth uses them. She is Catholic enough to satisfy the priest, practical enough to survive men's vanity. White planters will use words like superstition in public and send someone quietly for her when a child turns blue and the doctor's bottle has done nothing but quiet the crying. Morel Baptiste, Mimi, was born to this. Her mother, Agnes, delivered babies for 3 places, cut cords with boiled shears, and buried placentas somewhere foxes wouldn't find them. "You don't give a child second life to a thief," she told her girl, tying a red string around a wrist as she taught the knot. Mimi learned to measure by eye. She learned the sound a kettle makes when it is about to roll over and climb the stove. She learned how to look a man in the face in a way that said, without words, "I know the thing you don't want named, and I am deciding whether naming it will save anyone." Bois du Chêne belongs to the Deschamps. Bernard, who inherited 1,000 arpents and the belief that the bayou exists to reflect his gallery. Claire, who keeps saints velveted and children dressed, whose handwriting could make a clerk feel shamed. Côte Rouge belongs to the Levines. Louis, newly rich with a taste for red waistcoats. Adele, brittle in the way women get when their bodies have brought too many babies to graves. Harlan Place, named without poetry, is the American kitsch. Elijah Harlan, new money and new manners, an overseer from Natchez with a mean mouth. His wife, Eliza Jane, who brought Ohio china and never learned which insects matter here and which are simply the air. Mimi moves among these houses like the tide moves, visible only in the way other things answer. She catches babies, rubs sweet oil into bellies, tells women when to rest and when to get up. She does what men pretend they do when they sign papers. The difference is that people tend to live when she has been there. And then the math of the county changes, as math inevitably does. Sugar prices wobble, an engine at Bois du Chêne needs repair, Bernard Deschamps signs a note with a factor in New Orleans and tells his wife it is temporary. Temporary is what men call, "I cannot bear to name this yet." 2 months later, Elijah Harlan buys a note, and on a wet afternoon he buys Justine, Mimi's daughter and Justine's infant son, Basile. The act is legal. It is also an act. The notary records it. The priest, to whom Mimi goes with her hands unnaturally still, writes an extra line in his private book. Benedicta sit, mercy on us. That sail lands like a thrown brick at the center of Mimi's life. Traiteurs do not declare wars. They move harm. They make choices about where it stops. She sits on the back step of Bois du Chêne with her head down. When she raises it, something in the house, its gloss of certainty, shifts, if only a degree. The first strike is work wearing its own ordinary clothes. Late September 1856. The sugar house at Côte Rouge should be a humming hive preparing for grind. The rollers have been reseeded, the furnace bricks patched. What they are not supposed to be is loud. And yet, just after noon, there is a deep, unwilling noise. Steam climbs out of the boiler's safety like a thing remembering its shape. A laborer yells, "Valve!" and runs. The seam tears. Iron, when it is peeled back, does not look like anything but a flower impossible to name. 2 men die, and their names are written once and then never again in any book that survives. Louis Lavigne stands on the sugar house threshold with his hair ash white and his face pink, and says to the air, "This is why I said we must wait." He had not said it. He had said, "Hurry." The coroner calls it accidental. Dr. Celestine Heber writes "rupture, poor maintenance" in a private hand and does not share the page. Adele Lavigne, who cannot stand the smell of molasses now without thinking of iron and blood, asks the priest if she may cover the parlor mirror after sundown because she cannot bear to see her face when the house is dark. He allows. Mimi lays a line of salt behind the glass. She says nothing in the corridor because if she speaks there, the words will be for the walls and not for Adele. At Bois du Chêne, Bernard Deschamps stops going down to the mill. He sits in the chair by the dining room window and watches the bayou pretend to be still. He pours a dram of whiskey. He forgets that with weather like this you must open the cistern and scald every bucket with water that has seen a good boil. Claire, who never forgets, sends the kitchen girl to mind it. The kitchen girl gets waylaid because there is a boy in the yard with a mouth that makes time behave differently. The cistern blooms. In 2 days, half the house tastes pennies. Dr. Heber comes with his book and his laudanum. Mimi arrives with boiled willow and a look. "No," she tells Claire gently when the lady reaches for the bottle, and Claire, who has been a good Catholic all her life and a worse realist for almost as long, blushes and says, "All right," to a woman she is not supposed to obey. On Harlan Place, on a road where the dust is the color of heat, men with American mouths make American noises. Elijah Harlan wants sugar to obey Ohio clocks. He tells his overseer, a man named Pike, who has a long, necessary face, that Papa Celestine is late to his row. He says 5 lashes, because 5 is the number men like him use when they want to prove they are not sentimental. Later, when Pike is binding his hand where the strap pitted the skin, Elijah sees Justine and turns his eyes away because he has not learned how to look a person in the face after he has written her into income. Eliza Jane Harlan spends evenings playing "Listen to the Mockingbird" on a piano that is going out of tune in this wet and has never expected better. Mimi crosses that yard a week later in a borrowed shawl because she has been called for a fever, a child with 2 bright eyes, laudanum doing the thing laudanum does, quieted symptoms and invited worse. Elijah Jane meets her on the gallery because she believes in propriety, and propriety seems to her to mean ignoring that another woman's daughter is on the same land as her china. "You will use prayer," she says, and Mimi answers, "Yes," because it is the same truth whether or not the lady knows that prayers sometimes smell like willow and sassafras and a sprig of rue. Basile lives. Pike does not meet her eyes on the way out because fear and respect sit in the same chair in men like him, and he cannot decide which to stand for. The roomer that steps out of the quarter and crosses the road like a person with a right to walk there is not tidy. Rumor rarely is. It says that Mimi went into the sugar house at Côte Rouge the week before the boiler split, carrying a red thread. It says she sat on the cistern at Bois du Chêne for an hour one morning, just sitting, and when Claire asked her what she was doing, she said, counting how many days a house can ignore its own rules. It says she set a bowl of milk on the Harlan kitchen step, and the cats wouldn't touch it. It says she buried a bottle under the hearth. It says she tied 9 nails under a lintel. It says she prayed. It says she did nothing but work, and the work did what the work did. By December, the county is breathing wrong. Pierre Dugas, a boy from a place upriver, steps on a bent nail in a shed at Bellerive and thinks nothing of it because feet in this country always have stories to tell. He comes to Mimi the next day because his jaw aches and he feels a knot in his back he cannot untie. She lances and cleans and lays a poultice and prays words that pass through Acadian mouths before hers and West African ones before that. She knows she is too late. She sits with him while Dr. Heber has the dignity to admit that men like him are useless here. The lockjaw comes anyway. Heber writes trismus because it keeps his hand from shaking. The overseer at Harlan Place, who has been watching all this happen with animal eyes, sleeps with a pistol by the bed and dreams of iron that does not know his name. Then comes the night the house at Bois du Chêne decides to stop pretending.
January. A late storm shifts the air wrong and makes the Teche itself feel like a breath held too long. The gallery at Bois du Chêne has been braced badly against a tilt someone meant to fix in 1849 and never did. Bernard insists on supper on the gallery because habit is the drug genteel houses use. The brace fails with a pop like a knuckle. The floor slides half a foot into itself. No one dies. Bernard bangs his shin. Claire's hand spills wine. Something more basic to the house's self-understanding breaks. The next morning, the sheriff arrives with a deputy and a trustee, a man who says numbers in a voice he learned at a bank. The trustee asks for the stillroom inventory. He writes ratbane, 1 tin, ribbon tied, and looks foolish without knowing why. He writes Mirelle, nurse. Claire says no out loud. The trustee raises an eyebrow. He does not understand that this no has been running toward this threshold for a year. At Harlan Place, the rails start coming loose too. A lash falls on the wrong boy. Justine steps between because there is a limit to how much a mother can watch without her bones shouting. Pike pauses. Elijah does not. The strap lands anyway, and the yard goes quiet in the way only a yard can when it remembers history. Mimi is not there. She is at Cote Rouge, stanching a bleeding finger with a wisp of sugar wool, heavy with the knowledge that harm moves and that somebody's job is to make it trip. By spring, there is moss on every story. The Teche floods 2 inches too high, and every dike feels it. Weevils learn new doors. Adele Levine, who used to argue with her husband about whether she would sit when men called in the afternoon, now simply stays upstairs because the stairs feel safer than the gallery, and the mirror turned to the wall makes the evening a little less cruel. Dr. Hebert writes less Latin and more silence. In June, Mimi goes to Harlan Place with a purpose. She has not been asked. Eliza Jane stands stiff on the gallery, her dress too crisp for this air. "You cannot," she begins. And then she sees Mimi's face and changes the end of her sentence to nothing. "I brought this," Mimi says, and sets a small blue bottle on the kitchen table, tying a thread around its neck. Eliza Jane says, very quietly, "My Justine would be 20 this year if we had not crossed." It is the first time she has called Justine by her name. "The bottle will sit," Mimi says. "The harm will not." She turns and walks through the yard like a woman who has decided that fear and respect ought to be the same word in at least one language. 2 weeks later, lightning takes Belle Reeve's cornice like a signature on a letter. The pump breaks on the 5th bucket. Men build a fire line. Women carry out trunks and a portrait so heavy it feels like God. The big house blackens and goes gray. The kitchen house stands, as kitchens do. A bottle under the hearth survives because bottles often do. Accident, the paper reports. By July, the 3 households are not houses anymore. Cote Rouge stands with a crippled sugar house and a woman upstairs who will not open her mirror. Bois du Chêne wears boards where a gallery once praised itself and a trustee's handwriting where the china used to be. Harlan Place is still standing, but the center of it has moved. Elijah is selling cane to men he despises at prices he cannot afford to admit he needs. Pike goes quiet. Elijah Jane puts a blue cloth over the mantel glass and leaves it there when her friends laugh. Mimi helps deliver a child in a cabin by the fence line and never once looks at the house where the baby's father eats supper. Mimi minds her rope. She ties what she ties. She buries what must be buried. She does not let evil stay. Who investigated? No one with a badge whose job was truth. A coroner wrote misadventure whenever a machine made the noise a machine makes when it is tired. Dr. Hebert filled a ledger with Latin because Latin is a good place to hide a man's shame. Priests allowed mirrors to face the wall after sundown and wrote it in little books they did not bring to the bishop. Factors wrote numbers next to names. Notaries wrapped bills of sale in twine and told themselves they had no choice. A Charleston journalist wrote a paragraph about a sugar house explosion and moved on to a steamboat race. So the theories come from where theories always come from in places like this: kitchens, galleries, praise houses, the space between the bed and the wall where people lie awake and bargain. The Conjure Queen, the most satisfying to frightened men and the least honest to the record. In this reading, Mimi caused the boiler to split by moving a thread about a valve, poisoned a cistern with a word, sealed an overseer's jaw from a distance, and called lightning down on a cornice because the house had stored too many sins in its walls. The vocabulary exists for it: 9 nails, red thread, blue bottle under a hearth. It sells a tidy story. It also gives the people who built the machines a sweet alibi. The Saboteur and Her Companions, the version that keeps planters awake, that the enslaved community used what it knew of machines, tides, tastes, and tempers to slow the engines that ground them. A lamp forgotten, a pin not quite seated, a nail where a foot would find it, accidents multiplied by intention. There is a letter to the Opelousas Courier by a concerned proprietor calling for the removal of a dangerous woman known as Mimi, whose influence stiffens the blacks. That letter is confession by proxy. It admits power. It does not name its own. The Physics of Sugar and Water, the hardest to carry because it asks us to admit there is no villain big enough to use as a shield. Boilers rupture when men hurry repairs. Cisterns sour if you do not tend them after a storm. Tetanus lives in soil and waits for feet. Louisiana air makes iron bloom in the wrong places. Galleries collapse when you don't shore them. Lightning hits houses. These are ordinary ends. The ordinary, repeated, becomes legend. The Scapegoat. 3 houses fell because of her is a chorus men sing when they cannot bear to intone their own names as the cause. A midwife who knows how to quiet fever bears the blame for an economy that could only stagger so long before it tripped. A trotteur becomes a curse because it is easier to call a woman your devil than it is to admit you had been correcting poor God in his accounting for a generation, and he corrected you back. The ethic of a midwife. Not a theory so much as a refusal to let the others swallow the person. Mimi moved harm along. She anchored suffering so it would not look for easier prey. She held hands when Latin had no word left that mattered. She tied a red thread around a bottle because something in the room needed reminding who lived there. She was feared because she did not pretend ignorance, and because she looked men in the face in a way that taught them they were not the only ones who remembered. Separate what you can prove from the embroidery that makes proof bearable. The Cote Rouge boiler rupture happened. Dr. Hebert's notes and an insurance man's bored prose agree. The cistern at Bois de Chêne went bad after the storm. A stew of bilious complaints fills the doctor's ledger. An overseer, named Pierre Dugas at Belle-Rive in one account, or Pritchard at Harlan Place in another, the record cannot agree, died of lockjaw after a foot puncture. The Latin is clear, even if the name is not. A gallery at Bois de Chêne slipped. A trustee inventory exists with the humiliating line, rat bane, ribbon tied around. A lightning strike burned Belle-Rive. The paper calls it misadventure. The bottle under the hearth exists. A boy with a scar on his palm could show you where. Justine and her child were sold. The notary's act is hard ink. The buyer was Elijah Harlan. The seller, Bernard. Mireille or Mimi Baptiste is listed in inventories and in 1867 in a Freedmen's Bureau record as Mireille, no surname, midwife, paid $3 by the people of Cote Rouge for nursing. That is how a name lives when houses die. The records called it misfortune. The locals whispered something else entirely. After 1865, the Attakapas learned a new grammar: bureau, contract, share. The canes still hissed in the wind, and the boilers still did their work, but the men on the galleries did not stand as straight, and some of them did not stand at all. Traiteurs never vanished because need never does. Mimi's name slips out of ledgers and into mouths. In 1871, a woman signing with an X paid to a St. Martinville midwife reads, Mireille B., $2 for catching. Catching is the word that refuses to make birth into a doctor's victory and keeps it in the tense it belongs to, work done with hands. Bois de Chane's big house sank into its own cellar, a piece at a time, when the pilings admitted they had been asked to carry more than they could. Côte Rouge recovered and then did not. The sugar house's bricks sprouted weeds in the cracks men had set their promises in. Belle Reeve's live oaks kept their arms up and their roots down, and a girl in 1903 found a bottle under a hearth, and her grandmother told her to leave ghosts where they lie. Harlan Place turned into a smaller story. The house survived, the man did not. Eliza Jane learned to breathe without a piano and to keep a blue cloth over her mirror after sundown for the rest of her life, though she would not have been able to tell you why in a way that would have satisfied anyone but herself. Louisiana kept its bottle trees and its haint blue because they are pretty and because, as anyone who has lived long around illness and weather will tell you, you do everything that helps. The museum labels call them folklore. The people on porches call them Tuesday. Somewhere along the Tetch, a woman turns her mirror to the wall at dusk because her aunt did, and her aunt because of a woman named Mimi who once looked a man in the face and taught a house the difference between fear and respect. Perhaps the truth still lies hidden in a folded act under a notary's grandson's toy soldiers, in a priest's private book, in a sacristy drawer that sticks, in an old doctor's ledger that smells like wintergreen and shame, in a bottle under a brick a foot never found, a hair that never stopped insisting it had belonged to someone. It lives in the hum people hear when they stand by a sugar house ruin in a good wind, a pitch too low to be a song and too steady to be anything else. It is not a spell. It is what keeping the living alive sounds like when nobody upstairs wants to know how the trick is done.